working on my 1993 Dodge W250 Old Blue. I think I'm going to be having to replace my head gasket here pretty soon. When I was in here working on the tappet cover gasket and replacing it, I noticed what appeared to be a coolant leak coming from just underneath the thermostat housing. I've inspected it a little bit more and it appears to be leaking between the cylinder head and the block. I guess this is a pretty common leak point for these 12L Cummins motors. So I just took the truck off the road about a week ago, and here's the leak that is on my garage floor after parking the truck. You can see up here I've got red coolant inside the system right now. There's a little bit of coolant here, a bunch of coolant up in this area, and it's sort of leaking back. Okay, so I've got this coolant pressure testing system here. Got it pumped up to about 12 or 13 psi, and I'm not noticing any leaks from the suspected leak point or anywhere else for that matter, but the engine is cold right now. So this might be one of those types of leaks where it only leaks when the engine is up to temperature and those gaskets sort of expanded. Okay, we're back on the head gasket project for my first gen. All the parts arrived. We've got the head gasket kit and a couple other parts I needed for the exhaust manifold. All right, so in order to pull the cylinder head off, we really have to remove everything from the driver's side as well as the passenger side of the cylinder head. So all of these intake horn components, the exhaust manifold, the turbo, all the linkages here for the throttle, the injection lines that run over to the passenger side of the cylinder head. I'm going to start with the intake tube, and then we'll move on to the intake horn as well as some of the throttle linkages. So to get the injection pump lines off of the back of the injection pump, it's best to use a 17mm crow's foot wrench on a 3/8 drive ratchet, and you should be able to easily get in there, even with the lines on the way, to remove those. Okay, so the crow's foot and 17mm wrench worked pretty well to get all those injector lines off the back of the pump. Then I took 4 10mm bolts where the brackets are. So now these are all loose. I just need to run to the other side, break all those injector lines off of the injectors, and then I'll be able to pull the injector lines off. Okay, injector lines are ready to come off. Okay, I'm gonna pull this bracket off, 2 10mm bolts on the bottom of it, and then I'm also gonna take this air reference line off of the injection pump. There was a bracket back here that held up the wiring harness. I've removed all the wiring harness off the cylinder head and the injection pump. I'm gonna take off the fuel filter next, as well as this harness that goes to the fuel filter heater. I took off the fuel lines that ran to and from the fuel filter. So I've already drained the coolant and the engine oil out of this engine. Next, I'm going to remove the upper radiator hose. Also need to remove this bracket that comes to the oil fill tube. All right, so next I'm going to flip this lifting bracket at the back of the cylinder head. So the lifting bracket from the factory is pointing down. Take these 2 15mm bolts off, flip it around, put them back on, and then that'll give us our lifting point at the back of the engine, and the front of the engine will lift at the thermostat housing. All right, so I just want to show you the fuel return line for these injectors. It goes back behind the cylinder head, and then it tees into a point that returns as well from the injection pump. See this T line? This line comes from the injection pump. This is the line that comes up behind the cylinder head. 13mm fitting on this T you need to back off in order to remove the return lines from the cylinder head. While you're back here, also don't forget to disconnect your coolant sensor. And while I'm up here, I'm going to remove this 10mm bolt for the wiring harness that goes down to the crank position sensor. Okay, next I'm going to remove the fan and fan shroud as one complete assembly. There's 4 bolts on the bracket for the fan that you can easily get with a 10mm wrench. Before I do that though, I am going to pull the drive belt off, get my breaker bar in here on the tensioner. Next, I'm going to remove the alternator bracket off of the thermostat housing. 10mm bolt here. And then we've got one 13mm bolt at the bottom. There's also a grounding strap here for the alternator that connects to the bottom of the cylinder head. So I'm going to remove the injector return lines now. There's 6 10mm bolts that are attached to the injectors. You can see these copper sealing washers on each of them. That'll come in your upper head gasket kit, so don't worry about it if you lose one. And next I'm going to remove the temperature probe for my pyro. Next I'm going to remove these heater lines. In my truck, since I have a Webasto, I have it routed a little bit differently. So in your truck you'll have 2 heater lines. The return is down at the bottom, and the feed line will go right into your firewall. So I already soaked most of the exhaust components once in PB Blaster, but I just hit it again. All the exhaust manifold bolts and mating surfaces, as well as the turbo mating surface. Next up, I'm going to remove the turbo, so the exhaust flange and the compressor out flange, and then also on the bottom, the drain line that goes back to the block. All that needs to come off before I remove it from the exhaust manifold. All right, so these are 15mm nuts for the turbo flange. Okay, so I've got one 15mm nut left. Okay, so after I've penetrated all the bolts with PB Blaster, let it sit. I'm going to take off all the bolts on the exhaust manifold. Recommend using an impact, so that way it shakes them loose. I've got this Milwaukee high torque impact with a 13mm socket, and it'll pop these off no problem. Okay, I just used a 1/2-inch drive universal and extensions to get some of the back ones and lower ones. Alright. So now that we've got most of the stuff ripped off, let's take a closer look at the culprit coolant leak and see if we can actually tell where this is leaking from a little bit better. So it really does look like it's leaking from in between the cylinder head and the block. It's kind of a difficult point because it's right beneath the thermostat housing, so you would think that it's leaking from the thermostat housing, but it's actually in fact leaking between the cylinder head and the block. Okay, I'm going to pull out the injectors next. There's lock nuts on all of the injectors that take a 24mm. You just need to break them loose, back it all the way out, and then I'll be using this injector puller tool that I got off of Amazon. I'll link in the description box below. And you thread it onto the top of the injector after the lock nut's loose, and then you just tap up on it lightly until it comes right out. So just thread the puller on to the injector and then tap up till the injector comes out. I'm going to pop the valve covers off next. So now that we have all the valve covers off, I'm gonna pull all of the rocker arms and the push rods out. Since the injectors are off, we can literally just reach down and rotate the engine over by hand. Put one hand on each side of the crank there and just literally rotate it until we got both of these rocker arms are loose. Then I'll pull off the pedestal on this cylinder, and then I think 4 is loose as well. Yeah, 4 is loose, and then again we'll rotate it until we get number 2 loose on both the intake and exhaust, and then we'll probably do 2 and 5, and then rotate it again, do 3 and 6 until all the rockers and push rods are out. And again, big thing when you're doing this, just keep the parts organized as you're taking them out so they can go back in the same location. That includes all the rocker arms and the push rods. They can seat back in their exact same locations that they were. So we got 1 intake exhaust loose. Go for number 4. Okay, and now I'm going to rotate over until number 2 is both loose. All right, so we got number 2 and number 6 cylinders are loose now. So now that we have all the rocker pedestals and the push rods out of the engine, we can remove the head bolts, or the remaining head bolts at least. Each rocker pedestal had 1 head bolt in it. There's a sequence if the engine is hot. The factory service manual states there's a sequence that you need to remove the head bolts, and it also states if the engine's cold, it doesn't matter what sequence you remove the head bolts in. Here's that sequence. I'm gonna do it anyways, just because I have that sequence available. It'll give us that extra measure of reassurance as we remove the cylinder head that we don't warp it. Essentially, as we remove it, we just start in the middle and work our way out. There's 3 different lengths of head bolts, so just take note of that as you remove all the head bolts. I'm kind of surprised that little Milwaukee impact can take off all those head bolts. Okay, so I have the engine hoist hooked up to the cylinder head, just a bolt at the front hook point, and then another at the rear. I think what I'm going to try and do is just lift it up slowly and then maybe try and rotate it so I can clear the firewall a little bit. Bring it up as much as I can without hitting the hood, and then just pull it back. All right, so we got the cylinder head off, put it on the floor now. I took a few more pieces that were just on there, like the sensors and that intake plate off before I rested it on the ground here. But now we can inspect the culprit of why we're doing the head gasket. Okay, so we're at the front of the engine here at the corner. You can see just how externally the coolant was leaking and where it was coming from in this this cooling jacket. So the head gasket provides a seal around this cooling jacket. And I guess the seal just failed at this edge, maybe at this edge a little bit. You can see it's just how kind of gross it is around here. Here's the head gasket, same position. This is the top of it. Here's a close-up. You can see how it's not in the best of shape. And then on the bottom, same idea. So I'm not sure which side it was actually leaking from, but you can see on both sides of the head gasket it's not in the best shape. And obviously the culprit is right here at this corner. When we clean up the surface of the block, we'll have to make sure that it's really clean, and I'll check it for straightness as well. I have a long straight edge, and I'm hoping that this corner is not messed up just because of the coolant that's been leaking through there. So now we're at the point where we need to clean everything up, the block surface, a few of the parts on the bench now, and I also want to change, while I'm in here, there's a rubber hose that goes in between the drain line for the turbo and the part that goes into the bottom of the block. In terms of the work that needs to be done on the cylinder head, the machine shop's gonna do all the checks and everything. The valve stem seals that came with the kit, I'll give them to the machine shop. What they're gonna do is they're gonna take out all the valves, change the valve stem seals. I also want them to check the valve guides as well, make sure they're not too, like the valves aren't too wobbly within their guides. I believe they also check at the machine shop for like pressure testing of all the valves, make sure it can hold pressure without leaking. They'll also clean up the cylinder head, and then they'll deck the bottom surface of the cylinder head and make sure it's nice and flat. And that way we get back a nice clean cylinder head that's flat. So you can see, like I said, I have everything organized when it comes to the rocker arms and pedestals, all my bolts and push rods. Everything's in the same order of the way it was when it was in the engine. And then I also did the same with the injectors. I was thinking about rebuilding the injectors actually while they're out, so might do a separate video on that. So we'll get things cleaned up and I'll show you a bit closer of what the pistons and cylinder walls look like. But at a first glance, it looks really good. Of the piston walls that I can see, they all still have the cross-hatching pattern, and this motor has over 420,000 kilometers on it, so pretty happy about that. We'll get everything cleaned up and I'll show you everything once it's all cleaned up. Okay, I'm just gonna clean up the surface of the block here. I've got a M12 90-degree die grinder with a yellow bristle disc, 3M Rolock bristle disc. And I think it's about 80 grit is what the yellow is. But just on a low speed, I'm gonna go across, I've already done a little bit here, just go across at a light pressure, let the disc do the work, take off all the surface rust and debris until it's relatively clean, and then we'll go over it with brake cleaner and wipe off all the remaining residues. Okay, now that I've gone over most of the block surface with the 3M bristle disc, I'm gonna take this DuraBlock with a Scotch-Brite pad here, and this will act as a nice flat block, and I'll sand everything, get it nice and smooth, get the surface nice and polished. Essentially just get everything as flat as I can, and then we'll throw the straight edge on here and see how straight everything is. What I'm gonna do actually is spray a little bit of WD-40 on this. The WD-40 does a really good job of removing all the carbon deposits, and I'm going to use WD-40 on the tops of the pistons and inside the bowls to get all the carbon off. Clean everything up nice before I put it back together. So I'm just going to go over it again a couple more times with WD-40 and the Scotch-Brite on the DuraBlock. Okay, so I've got the cylinder head back from the machine shop now. A couple things I want to do before I reinstall the cylinder head. I want to paint the cylinder head. I'm going to paint the valve covers. I also have the steed speed that got here. I'm gonna port match the cylinder head to the steed speed. I just wanna show you differences in the gaskets. These gaskets, single layer steel, came with the Malle kit for both the exhaust ports on the manifold as well as the turbo flange. The ones that come with the steed speed kit, they're multi-layer on both the flanges off the manifold as well as to the turbo. These are about the same between the Malle kit and the steed speed, and the steed speeds are a bit bigger than the Malle. You can see they're just slightly bigger. The ports are pretty well matched on the steed speed to the gaskets, but on the cylinder head they can be opened up quite a bit. So I'm going to do that on all 6 exhaust ports of the cylinder head. Just with a Dremel, I'm going to open it up to match the gaskets here. So that way they'll match the flanges of the steed speed. And then between the outlet on the steed speed and the turbo, I'll take a look. But you can see here, the steed speed isn't quite as large as the gasket that it comes with. And I'll have to check the inlet on the turbine housing to see what it looks like. And you can see on the exhaust housing of the turbo, it's not opened quite as much. I've got the grinder that I'm going to use. It's just Milwaukee 90 degree cordless grinder. I've got a bunch of different carbide burring tools. This is the one I'm going to start with. And then here on the cylinder head, on the exhaust side, I've got these gaskets on there just with a couple studs. And then I've taken a silver Sharpie and marked on the inside of this gasket of all the area that I'm going to grind. You can see exactly the surface area that I need to grind down in order to make it match the exhaust gasket as well as the exhaust manifold. So you can see in this cylinder, I've ported the exhaust port to match this gasket and also match the exhaust manifold. You can see this one I haven't touched yet. So all of this material here needs to come out when I port match this one. Okay, so I finished up port matching the exhaust ports on the cylinder head. A close-up view of what it looks like. Mostly I took the material out of the sides and the bottoms. There was quite a bit of material on the inside here and then on this outside edge that I had to take off, at least deeper into the port. And then for the bottoms and tops, I really just had to sort of, from this far back to here, really take it down on the bottom side. And the top, I would say, was probably the least out of all sides, but I did take quite a bit of material off, as you can see by all the shavings on the ground. I know you can go a lot more in depth on these cylinder heads when it comes to porting and polishing. I'm only going to be doing the exhaust ports as I don't feel overly comfortable kind of digging in super far in deep into these passageways, because I don't want to hit any of the cooling jackets by accident, and then next thing you know I have to scrap the entire head. But this is a good little addition that I can do to add some performance and give me some better flow, hopefully improve the turbo spool a little bit. I probably won't be able to tell since I have the steed speed and doing this at the same time. I'm not sure which one's going to be contributing to better turbo spool. Now that all of these are done, I'm gonna blow out, you can see I put rags in the exhaust ports there. I'm just gonna blow them out, get as many of the shavings out as possible. It probably would have been a good idea to do this before I sent this to the machine shop. I just didn't have my steed speed here in time. The steed speed actually took about 9 weeks to get here, so I was waiting on it. So I had the cylinder head at the machine shop. Now that this is all done, the last thing I'm gonna do is port match this to the turbo. This is just the stock H1C. You can see these ports are a little bit larger than not only the stock manifold, but the turbo as well. So what I'm gonna have to do, I think, is remove a little bit of material on the outsides of here and then a little bit on the tops and bottom. You can see kind of where the gasket's sealed here. So I just finished up port matching this exhaust turbine on the turbo. You can see again, compared to the gasket, it's not perfect, but these openings are definitely bigger than the outlet of the exhaust manifold. Okay, so we've got the entire head painted now. I installed the exhaust manifold on here as well. A little bit of information on this exhaust manifold for the mounting. It doesn't come with hardware from Steed Speed, so you need to get your own. What I opted to use was studs for all the mounting points. These are grade 12.9 50 millimeter studs. And then I used copper flange nuts. I got all of this off of eBay, and I'll also link it in the description box below if you're interested in using the same hardware. The gaskets that the Steed Speed come with are actually like a triple layer steel gasket and much thicker than the ones that are in the Male kit. Same with the one down here. It's like a triple layer, if you can see it right there. It comes with the studs for the end of the manifold here and all the mounting hardware, including all the gaskets. It's just doesn't come with these studs or nuts. And the bolts on your original manifold will not work since the Steed Speed mounts right up on the flanges here, and the stock ones have a little bit of a spacer. When I painted everything, I had the manifold off. I taped off all the exhaust ports. I had all the valve covers on here, and I put the intake plate on and the intake horn, as well as all the sensors, the thermostat on there. I tried to put as much on there as possible so that way I could get everything painted in one shot. I used the old valve cover seals while I was painting, and then I'll take those off, and I have some new ones in the head gasket kit that I'll put on there when I put everything back together. And I also put a coat of that same paint on the compressor housing here, and then I put a coat of graphite lubricant on the exhaust housing, which is a high temperature thing that you can use on exhaust housings. Here's the paint that I used on the valve covers and head. Cummins Bluke 3885911. It's a very close match to the original, if not the original color on this engine. I know I've seen some engines that are a darker black and some that are blue. The two trucks that I have this like really dark bluish color, and this was actually a really good match for that. So for the valve cover there, I don't think I'm gonna repaint that. It's actually in pretty good shape. I'm just gonna throw it on there at the end. This isn't perfect. Like, you can see a lot of the imperfections from the paint beneath it. I don't have a sandblaster or anything, and I didn't really feel like sanding all those because that would take quite a bit of time. I just wanted to get everything painted, and we'll throw it back on there. If I ever get around to it and get a sandblaster one day, I'll media blast those down and then get them coated or powder coated or something. But again, this is just the beater truck, I guess. So I'm almost at the point now where I can get the cylinder head back onto the engine. I just want to show you a couple of things that you can do while the head is off in terms of taking a few measurements in the cylinder bores, and that'll allow you to check to see if your cylinder bores are still in good shape or not. So we're going to check the rocker assemblies and the push rods before we put them back in the engine. In the factory service manual, there's complete instructions on how to disassemble these rocker assemblies and check them. So essentially all it is you have a snap ring here, and the rocker arm will come right off. There's a washer, so it goes snap ring, washer, rocker, and then the shaft. So do that both sides. So after taking this apart, clean everything up. I have an ultrasonic cleaner, so what I did was I put these parts in the ultrasonic cleaner for a short period of time, clean everything up, wipe it down, get all the grease and grime off, and you can take a set of calipers. And what you want to do is you measure the shaft as well as the bore of the rockers, and there's tolerances for both of those. So the rocker lever bore diameter is a maximum of 19.05 millimeters or 0.75 inch. Looks like I have 0.75 on the nose. Our maximum allowable is 0.75 inch. We'll check the other one. And I have 0.75 as well. Now I can check the shaft diameter. The maximum shaft diameter is 18.94 millimeters or 0.746 inches. So it looks like I've got 0.73, almost 4. Check the other side. 0.74, maybe like 4.2-ish. So this is good. Now I'm going to re-lubricate everything, reassemble it, and then I'll check all the other 5 rocker assemblies, make sure that they're within tolerances. If they're not within tolerances, you're gonna have to find a new set and replace them. Okay, I've gone and checked all my rocker assemblies. They're all good. Now the next thing we wanna do is check inside the cups and the balls, as well as check for straightness of all the push rods. So check inside the cups, make sure there's no major scoring or cracks. Same on the ball end. We'll check this for straightness as well. Just look right down it. I'll go ahead and check the other 11 push rods now. Okay, so before we put the cylinder head back on, there's a couple things that we can check on the block side. One of them is the bores of the cylinder, and the other is the surface where the cylinder head sits. I've got this boroscope. We're gonna check the cylinders first. In the factory service manual, pop this up on the screen, but you can check for the out of round and taper. So the out of round is just the cylinder bore here. You can take measurements on this is the thrust axis side, and the non-thrust axis side. The thrust axis side is because the power, when the connecting rods and crankshaft are rotating, that's where most of the wear occurs. So if I rotate this cylinder number 2 all the way to the bottom of the bore, So I've got cylinder number 2 at the bottom of the bore. If you look into here, what you want to see is a crosshatch pattern inside the cylinder around the entire cylinder wall. But you'll see on the thrust axis, either on this side or the other side, there will likely be some vertical scoring marks from the piston moving up and down on the thrust axis. With the boroscope, we're going to measure our taper and out of round. So out of round being a measurement on the thrust axis and a measurement on the non-thrust axis. And then our taper, what we're going to measure is 3 different spots on the cylinder wall, the top, middle, and then at the bottom. And we're going to measure that on our thrust axis and our non-thrust axis. And if their cylinder is wider at the top and more narrow at the bottom, that'll tell us if we have a taper. And in the factory service manual, there's specifications for the out of round and taper and what the maximum allowable differences are for those. Okay, so from start to finish, I'm gonna show you how to measure this. So you take our boroscope, you've got our micrometer, set the micrometer to our minimum measurement for what the bore should be, which in this case is 4.0157 inch. So I set my micrometer at 4.0157. Get our boroscope in there and then we zero it out. So kind of wiggle it around here and then get it to the point where our gauge reads 0 and then turn the face of the gauge so it's at 0. Then we go over to the truck. Okay, I'm gonna do cylinder number 3. We'll get that piston right to the bottom of the bore. That's about the bottom. We'll wipe the cylinder wall down. We'll take our boroscope. I'm gonna put it on the non-thrust axis first, at the top, just below the ridge line of the carbon buildup. It looks like 1.5 thousandths. The middle looks like 1.5 thousandths. The top, 1.5 thousandths. We do the same on our thrust axis. Okay, so I finished taking all my measurements for the out of round and taper on all the cylinders. Everything came out pretty good. The max specifications for out of round are 1.5 thousandths of an inch for out of round and then 3 thousandths of an inch for taper. All of our taper, looks like our max taper that we got was 1/2 of 1 thousandths of an inch. So we're plenty good there. The only issue I had was on cylinder 4. Looks like our out of round was 2 thousandths, which is 1/2 of 1 thousandths above the allowable. Now, some of my readings I might have just misread 1/2 of a thousandths. It's very, very close. So, you know, I could go back and double check that measurement to make sure that I'm okay. But otherwise, all the cylinders are looking really good for this amount of kilometers on this engine, and I'm pretty happy. If you had something that was way out of whack here, you would really want to consider pulling the engine and getting it rebored or getting a new block if something was completely out of whack. Okay, so next we're going to check for the head distortion or the combustion surface distortion. So in the factory service manual, it states that in one 2-inch diameter, the variation that's allowed is 0.0004 inch, and then the overall variation from end to end or side to side is, so I'll show you what that looks like, the overall variation. So we make sure our block surface is clean here. Now my straight edge isn't quite long enough to get across all 6 cylinders. Ideally your straight edge is, but what we can do is check for straightness across the block here. That does not fit under in the middle, and then we can do that across like on an angle this way as well, and then the other way just to check. That's the max allowable. Now what I can get in there, we'll test what our maximum is just straight across. This is 2 thousandths, 0.002. So I can't even get 2 thousandths under. Let's try on this. One thing you can do is take a flashlight too, see if it fits under, or see if you can see any light under from one side. 0.0015, not quite. There we go. So that fits under 1.5 thousandths in the middle. This has got quite a bit of resistance, but it can fit. That one doesn't fit. So just check that in various spots, see what you have for a feeler gauge that can fit under there. And then, yeah, right there, there's 1.5 thousandths right in the middle. Then refer to the factory service manual. Obviously, you're not going to be able to take out the block and machine it. So ideally, you don't have any more than a few thousandths of distortion on the block side. And then you take the cylinder head to the machine shop and get it surfaced so it's nice and flat on the cylinder head side. Okay, so next up, I'm going to go ahead and go to every single bolt hole around all the cylinders. We'll clean it out. I'll shoot a little bit of brake cleaner in there and I'll blast it out with air. I'm just going to use a rag over it while I blast it out to prevent, you know, a giant mess. Made a giant mess in my wall. I'm going to go through and do this just a couple times, make sure all the oil's out of there. So the next thing we're going to do is go through and check all of the stock head bolts to see if they're stretched beyond the point of using them again. Here in the head gasket kit comes this little tool. It says cylinder head cap screw length gauge. So it says B and C series engines cylinder head cap screws must be tightened with the torque plus angle method, which means they can be reused because they're not torque to yield. So to determine if the cap screw has been stretched beyond reuse limit, place the cap screw head against the base of the slot, line with the edge of the gauge, discard the cap screw if threaded and extends beyond the maximum allowable length. Do not shorten the cap screw. So here you can see the one side has the B series, the other side has the C series. So there's 3 different screw lengths on the B series Cummins. So we'll take, this is our shortest one. And if it extends beyond the edge of this gauge here, when it's just flush like that, then we can't reuse it. So in this case, you can see there's a gap at the end, so we can use this one. We'll go through, here's the second longest one. Same idea, this is not stretched. And then we'll take our longest one here, and it as well is not stretched, you can see at the end of the gauge. So I'm gonna go through, check all of these head bolts, see if any of them are beyond the stretch limits that we can't reuse them. Okay, I just went through them all and checked them. They were all just fine. None of them were stretched beyond the point of using them again. I already ran them through the ultrasonic cleaner for about 30 minutes each. Some of these though have a little bit more grime on them than others. So I might just use a dye, run through all these head bolts real quick and clean up these threads. You can also use a tap to clean up the threads on the block, but I use the brake cleaner there, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to thread these in all by hand after I put the head on, and instead of risking the chance that I'm cutting new threads in the block, I'm just going to clean these up with a die, make sure they're good, hand thread them in once I have the cylinder head on. Okay, so next up I'm going to replace this hose that goes between the turbo drain line into the block. There's a small hose in there. It's a good idea to replace that while we're doing all this. Get the old hose off. Here you can see the old, most likely original hose. And compared to the new hose. Get our new hose on. Okay, we're ready to throw back in the steel drain pipe. Here's a look at the drain tube with the new rubber hose on there. I ended up using the old clamps because they screwed on a little bit better than the new ones. All right, I'm going through now doing a final cleaning of all the cylinder bores and the block surface. What I'm gonna do is get the pistons to the tops of their bore, blow out around the piston ring lands on the pistons, and then as I rotate the pistons to the top too, I'm gonna wipe the cylinder walls of any debris. Do that a few times, and once everything's relatively clean, I'm gonna take some engine oil on my hand or a rag and lubricate the cylinder walls just a little bit and the tops of the pistons. Okay, so I'm gonna go through and do that one more rotation of the engine. All right, so I've just soaked the shop towel in a little bit of fresh engine oil. I'm gonna go through and just wet down all the cylinder walls and the tops of the pistons. Inside the bowls of the pistons too. And then I'm going to rotate the engine over, do the same on the other piston walls. Okay, and then I'm going to run it through a few rotations of the engine, get it all nice and lubricated. Okay, before we slap the head gasket on, I'm gonna take some brake cleaner on a rag. Get the surface of the block as clean as possible now, with no oil residues. Okay, and then I'm gonna give it one final blow with the air. So before I slap the cylinder head back on and the head gasket, what I just did was I put the #1 piston on the compression stroke at top dead center. And how I did that was the timing pin that is beneath the injection pump. There's a small timing pin. Push that in while cranking over the engine, and then as piston #1 came to the top, so on the compression stroke, then that pin slid into its hole, and then that locked the engine. Now be careful, that timing pin is plastic and it can break. Just don't overdo it when you're cranking over the engine or barring over the engine. So here, just beneath the injection pump, you can see where my finger is here. This is the timing pin that you need to push in on while you're rotating, barring the engine over. And once it pops into place, that's when you know that #1 cylinder is on the compression stroke and it's at top dead center. Okay, it's time to slap the head gasket on now. It can only go on one way. So line it up with your dowel pins. Here's my setup for getting the cylinder head on. I have an engine hoist. What I want to try and do is get the chain as tight as I can here, because I don't have a lot of clearance when the hood is on to get this arm up as high as I need to. And same way when I took it off, I think the best way is to really go in the engine bay, like kind of on an angle sideways, and then rotate it into position and then lower it down. You can see it's slightly angled here, but I'm just going to use my hand to kind of position it like this, level it out as I lower it. Here's a look at I never showed the machine surface, but here's a look at the machine surface on the bottom. Okay, next up we're going to install all the push rods. I've dipped the tops and the bottoms of these in engine oil after cleaning them. Just put it down into the hole and you'll sort of feel it seat into a little bit of a cup if you wiggle it around. So we'll do that with all the push rods and then move on to the rocker lever assemblies. Okay, we're going to install all the rocker pedestal assemblies next. Just make sure you put a little bit of oil on the tops of the valves, as well as the tops of the push rods. These rocker assemblies, I backed out completely the adjusting nuts and set screws for the valve clearance. So back those out on all the assemblies before you install them. I'm going to put them on just in place, and then finger tighten the smaller bolts that go in the front. What we're going to do is torque down all of the head bolts, and then we're going to tighten these smaller bolts down for the rocker assemblies. Okay, we've got all the rocker assemblies in there. Next up, we're going to put in all of the head bolts and finger tighten them down all the way, and then begin the torque sequence. Just a reminder, before we install the head bolts, we've already blown out all the holes and cleaned them up before we install the head. I lightly coated all the head bolts and cleaned up all the threads with a dye on all the head bolts. I'm gonna finger tighten them all down all the way. And just a reminder, I'm putting all these head bolts in the exact same spots that they came out. Okay, tightening up the head bolts is a 3-step sequence according to the service manual. First step, you go to 66 foot-pounds in this sequence, which will pop up on the screen. Second step, you go in sequence again to 89 foot-pounds. And then the third step, you tighten all the bolts in sequence again, an additional 90 degrees. So it says 66 foot-pounds the first pass, check all the bolts again. And if they're lower than 66 foot-pounds, tighten them to that torque. Step 2, tighten all the bolts in sequence to 89 foot-pounds, check all the bolts. And if they're not at 89 foot-pounds, tighten them to 89 foot-pounds. And then the third pass, you tighten in sequence all the bolts an additional 90 degrees. This is where it's useful to have a tool like this, a digital torque wrench. This is 1/2-inch drive, and this gives you angle as well. So on that third pass, I'll be able to change this to degrees instead and easily tell that I've gone on all bolts an additional 90 degrees. And I'll mark on that final pass, I'll mark all the bolts before I do my third pass to ensure that I don't miss any when I go on that third final pass of 90 degrees. So first step in sequence is to 66 foot-pounds. So the first pass is done. Now I'm going to go around in the same sequence, double check that they're all 66 foot-pounds, and then we can move on to the second pass. All right, so I essentially had to do a full second pass to get everything to 66 foot-pounds.
Now we can move on to our second pass, which is 89 foot-pounds in that same sequence. And then we'll double check everything again in sequence to make sure it's at 89 foot-pounds.
Okay, we're ready to do our final 90-degree torquing sequence on the head bolts.
What I just did for our own reference, and we can double check afterwards, is put straight lines in all of the head bolts.
And then that way when we do our 90 degrees, we can do a quick visual check to make sure everything is turned 90 degrees and we didn't forget a head bolt.
Okay, 26 head bolts, 90 degrees.
So that head bolt final torque was 145.6 foot-pounds. So reset it.
And move on to bolt number 2.
And that was 145 foot-pounds. That one was 155 foot-pounds. Okay, we just finished the torque sequence on all the head bolts.
And we can double check our work here with those markings that we made. Make sure that we've tightened down all of our head bolts, all 26 of them.
Next, we'll torque down all of our rocker lever assembly bolts, the smaller ones here. They're 13 mil, they get tightened to 18 foot-pounds. So next up, we're gonna set the valve clearance adjustment. So as we did before we put the cylinder head back on, if you haven't done that yet, use the timing pin beneath the injection pump to locate top dead center for cylinder number 1 on the compression stroke. So once we have the timing pin engaged, cylinder number 1 is at the top of its bore on the compression stroke. We can adjust half the valves, and then after that, we'll remove the timing pin, rotate the engine 360 degrees, and set the other half of the valves. It's very clear in the factory service manual on how to do that. So the valve clearance adjustment for the intake valve is 10 thousandths, and then for the exhaust valve is 20 thousandths. So we'll go according to this diagram, set half the valve adjustments, and then we'll rotate 360 and then set the other half of the valves.
After we set the valve lash on these rocker arms, these nuts get tightened to 18 foot-pounds.
So we'll start with cylinder number 1 intake.
Okay, so 10 thousandths on the intake. Tighten this down, and you want to go a little bit looser just so there's a little bit of drag on here, but not too much, because when you tighten down this set nut, it's going to make this a little bit tighter, and that's pretty good right there. So I'll do my exhaust the same way, and the rest of the cylinders. Rotate 360, and we'll do the other half.
So now we need to make sure to disengage that timing pin.
All right, so I got the timing pin out, and should make a mark on the harmonic balancer there. You can see the mark just to the left of that crankshaft position sensor. Now I'm gonna rotate clockwise 360 degrees, and once it's back on the left side of that crankshaft position sensor, we are ready to set the other half of the valve. Just make sure for the ones that you haven't set yet, screw them down just a little bit to make sure they're seated properly into the push rods.
Okay, at this point, I'm just gonna go back through, double check my work on this step, 10 thous on the intakes, 20 thous on the exhaust for half these valves. I'll rotate back 360, double check again that I put the right 20 thou and 10 thou
on the correct intake and exhaust as specified in the factory service manual. Now I'm going to double check and make sure all these nuts are to 18 foot-pounds. Okay, we're at the point where we can set all the valve covers on next. Don't forget to put the new O-rings on the bottoms of your valve cover bolts, as well as the new gaskets I got from the gasket kit for the bottoms of the valve covers. Okay, and all these valve cover bolts get tightened to 18 foot-pounds. So I've installed a few things on the driver's side, the AFC line to the injection pump. I also got my Webasto feed line on the back of the block there, and I got the fuel filter heater back on underneath the fuel filter. Couple of the fittings here. Next, I'm going to move on to installing this exhaust manifold blanket before I put the turbo on. I've also got a blanket for the exhaust turbine housing on the turbo. There we go. Exhaust manifold blanket is fully installed. Okay, so next I'm going to put the turbine housing blanket on. Just got this, and then there's a couple little steel straps to tie it down. All right, I'm gonna make the oil feed line that runs to the turbo now. I didn't have the right fittings at first. I thought it was going to be 1/8 inch MPT to 6 AN for my lines. And then I realized that these factory fittings, they're M12 by 1.5, and it has an O-ring at the base. So I got these as well from Evil Energy. These are M12 by 1.5 with O-rings on the bottom, and then they adapt right to 6 AN. So I can use a number of these 6 AN fittings on both ends, on the turbo end and on the block end. And I can go right from this fitting with the O-ring into my 6 AN line, go as far as I need to, either use 90 or a straight, and go right between the block and the turbo. And this will just thread on no problem on each side. Okay, I've measured the hose to the correct length that I need it. Wrap this in a bit of tape, and now I'm going to cut it with a hacksaw. We'll unwrap the tape. We'll peel back the outer layer to expose the inner PTFE so we can place the fitting on. Before you put your fitting on, make sure to get the end piece on first. Now we can place our inner fitting on the PTFE and make sure it's seated all the way. And check the inner PTFE with a special tool. Make sure it's still round on the inside. So now we've got our hose with the inner fittings. We can put our 90 and 45 on the ends and tighten them up. I've got one end in the soft jaws on the vise, and I'll use this 19mm wrench to tighten up the fitting the rest of the way. Okay, here we go. We've got one completed turbo oil feed line that we can go and install on the truck now. All right, I've already installed the metric to AN fittings. I'm gonna put my 45 on this side and then the 90 up here. Okay, and here's a closer look at the finished product for the oil feed line. Comes out 45, comes up, sweeps over, does a 90 into the top of the turbo. You can see this is kind of touching a little bit here, but I've got this manifold blanket on here and that'll protect that line no problem. All right, so all the injectors, I've put the copper washers on. A little trick just to keep them in place while you install them is put a dab of grease under all the washers. So we'll go ahead and clean out the bores on the cylinder head, and I'll install the injectors next. They've been fully rebuilt and set the pop pressures to about 3,700 PSI. Now before I install the injectors, I'm going to clean out the bores of the injector holes. Probably should have done this when the head was off, but got this specialty tool just to get down on the bores, clean them out, and then we'll blow it out with air. We'll go ahead and do that with all 6 injector bores. So when installing the injectors, here there's just a little ball on one side of the injector that sticks out. If you look down into the bores, there's a little slot or groove that those balls sit into. So that way it orients the return hole facing towards the outside of the motor. So just keep note of that when you install the injectors to get it right into that groove. You can see if I'm outside of the groove, the injector sits a little higher. When it's in that groove, it pops right down where it needs to sit. Then the hold down goes over top. I found it tough to install the dust seal with the hold down. Really, you kind of just have to put the dust seal on after it's torqued down and push it down with a flathead screwdriver or something. But these hold downs get torqued to 44 foot-pounds. So just make sure your injector's seated again correctly. Take your 24 mil deep socket and torque it down to 44 foot-pounds. And then afterwards, throw your dust seal on. It's a little awkward because it's a bit of a tight fit, but push it down into place and then get it fully seated. I'm just using a flathead screwdriver. Okay, there we go. We'll do that for the rest of the injectors. Next up, I'm gonna install the return line for the injectors. I painted it. When we install this, the hard part is this part of the return line down on the driver's side of the block in the back corner. So don't forget, on each of the connection points for the injectors, the copper washer that's kind of shaped like a U gets installed around the injector lines. The banjo bolt goes through them. For the banjo bolts, you just have to snug them up. Don't overdo it. All right, next up, we can reinstall the injector lines. All right, so I went ahead and reconnected all of the electrical harnesses, the throttle linkages, put the intake pipe back on. I tightened up all the injector lines on the back of the pump. Best to use a crow's, or at least for me, I use a crow's foot wrench just to get access. Some of them are harder to access on the back side of the pump. At this point, I've got everything back together and I'm gonna fill up the coolant and put the engine oil back in. I've also got a boost leak tester. That's just a rubber boot that can go on the front of the turbo there. And I can pressurize the system, check for any boost leaks, and then I'll be able to bleed the fuel system after that and test fire up the engine. All right, I'm just gonna bleed the fuel system. I've cracked the fuel line that comes up just below the fuel filter here. Okay, we'll tighten this back up. Now we're bled up to the fuel filter. Now I'm going to crack all the injector lines loose. We'll crank over the engine until we get fuel at all the injector lines, tighten them up. All right, here is the first crank over. So it's not gonna start, but I'm gonna watch for the fuel shooting out of the injector lines. There was quite a bit more fuel that time, so I'm going to tighten up all the injector lines and we are ready to fire it up. So it looks like my idle is going to have to go up a little bit. We got good oil pressure, good fuel pressure. EGT probe is reading. Things are looking okay. Okay, so I've been driving the truck now about a week after the head gasket job has been completed. Everything's running really nice on the truck. It actually runs super smooth after I rebuilt those injectors. So combination of rebuilding the injectors and replacing the head gasket got this truck running back to where it should be. Really no issues so far. I'm very happy with the way it runs. If you're looking to do this same job on your 12 valve, hopefully this video helps you. And thanks for watching. Cheers.